What do you think? Do you think that the Russians are going to pop like 1 billion barrels a day of supply onto the marketplace or not?
Yeah, so that's what Russia would like to do, but we think the Saudis have a much different plan. And I think, as you pointed out here, the oil prices sharply declined last week based on the Russian comment that they wanted to raise production about 1 million barrels a day and basically bust up the OPEC production cut deal, which has been really so effective in raising prices, in addition to some geopolitical risks. So the market consensus last week basically viewed that 1 million barrels a day increase as sort of a done deal. But we think it's far from a done deal, and in our view, any production that would be added, if any, would be symbolic and modest and really stay within the OPEC production cut agreement cap. And so what's really going on here is that the Russians are once again, and there's a bit of a pattern with this, sort of agitating to raise production. And a lot of this has to do with their own internal domestic situation. Their oil companies, which by the way are public companies. Most of them are public companies. So they're basically being handcuffed on production and new projects and things. So since really last fall, they've been agitating to get Russia to exit the deal or to facilitate an early exit of the deal. What happened instead in November of last year was OPEC decided they were going to extend the deal for all of 2018. And so oil prices have risen, I think, higher than most people thought. At this point, I think most folks thought that it would be towards the end of this year. Instead, it's happened quicker, and that's because the global crude stocks have declined quicker, and that is really the result of Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela has lost about 600,000 barrels. Under the OPEC deal, they're allowed to be producing about 2 million barrels a day. They're only producing 1.4 as of April, and all of that, of course, is involuntary cuts. They're not doing it willingly. It's just because of mismanagement and chaos in Venezuela. So that's really accelerated the decline in crude stocks. And so from a fundamental standpoint, oil prices should be really healthy. You throw in the Iran nuclear deal or continued declines in Venezuela, strong demand, and other macro factors that you talk about. And so oil prices, I think, justifiably went up to about $80, something we actually talked about a month and a half ago in another video series at Hedgeye. But essentially what's going on is the Russians want to increase production now. The Saudis are also getting calls from, they had the Trump tweet, telling them that prices were artificially high. They had the energy minister of India call them to complain about high oil prices. The IEA also made some noise about concern about high oil prices. But I think what people need to realize at $80, the Saudis are really not fazed about oil prices. I mean, that's a very healthy price in terms of what they're trying to do, both with their own budget and also with the Aramco IPO. I just found out yesterday or this morning, I can't remember, yesterday or early this morning when I was checking, but the Saudi currency reserves for April were up, the highest they've ever been. I think it was like $13 billion in 1 month because of high oil prices. So things are going well according to their plan. So why didn't the Saudis just shoot this thing down last week? And it's really because they don't want any kind of daylight between them and the Russians in terms of market coordination. They think it's very valuable in terms of the psychology of the market. And so they want to keep Russia very close to the fold. So I think they're playing ball on the idea of adding production. But I think their plan is to convince the Russians and enlist others to convince the Russians that any kind of increase should be modest and really just symbolic. And so that's really where we stand. There's a meeting this weekend in Kuwait among the Gulf producers, the Saudis, Kuwaitis, UAE, and I think Oman is coming. And that's really designed to enlist their help to convince the Russians that a million barrel a day increase is really not advisable. So I think once it becomes clear that's not going to happen, I think you're going to see oil prices start rising. You're starting to see a little bit of it now, but it's really based on news reports that others in OPEC are not signed on to this deal because they weren't consulted. And so there's a lot of news stories yesterday and today about dissension in OPEC, and this might be a rough meeting. I'm not really worried about the dissension in OPEC part of this. It's really the Russia-Saudi dynamic that I think is worth following. There is a wild card that Russia could decide to just walk away from the deal, but I kind of think that's unlikely. I think they, every time they do this before a meeting or even a bilateral meeting between the Russians and the Saudis, they always sort of voice openly concerns about the deal and maybe they should get out. And then after the meeting, they basically come to the Saudi side. So I think that will happen. The other thing that people might forget is the Saudis have invested a lot of money in the Russian economy and in Russia projects. The King of Saudi Arabia made his first trip ever to Russia last year. So the Russians have a lot riding on this relationship with the Saudis economically, and so therefore I think, as I said at the top, that we're not really looking at a million barrels a day increase. It's maybe 300,000 barrels a day. If at all. I think the Saudis would like it to be close to zero. So I'll leave it there, and I'll open it up to you.
Yeah, that's an important point. I mean, so we have a timeline. We have some meetings this weekend. We have some specific numbers. So to me, I mean, as long as they walk it back off anything that's a million is a head grab. It's like a head scratcher, but it's also a head grabber. It grabs your eyes and focuses them on the screen because so many people got long energy after the move and got long oil. I mean, their net long position in crude oil contracts, which we can show via CFTC futures and options positioning, is 680,000 contracts. It's not as high as it was, but it can definitely go back to almost 800,000 contracts net long. And to me, the setup here would be anything like that. So just trying to get my arms around one more specific answer from you here, Joe, in terms of like what the number could actually be. You mentioned the Saudi cap. Like, how much can the Saudis raise production? And what do you think that would look like? Would they go say, okay, look, we're going to raise by this, you raise by the same, the number will be that, and the number's well inside of this million barrel number that the street is scared of?
Yeah, so the Saudis are basically underproducing according to their cap, and so they could be producing about 100,000 barrels more than they would normally, or than what they're allowed under the agreement.
Okay.
And so they could contribute 100,000 barrels to it, and without any trouble at all. And then you could see the Russians sort of matching that because they're basically on par in terms of their contribution to the deal. And then you would have a collection of others. UAE, Kuwait, then you had some non-OPEC participants like Kazakhstan, which is bringing on a massive new upstream project that basically already told OPEC they can't comply anymore with the agreement. So you'd probably have another 100,000 from them. And so you're looking at probably about a 300,000 barrel increase, which really would be, I think, symbolic because, I see another 500,000 barrels coming off in Venezuela. So that'll put them down to about, below 1 million barrels a day in production at the end of the year. They're losing about 50,000 barrels a day per month.
Wow.
And then you have the Iran deal, and it's becoming clear, I think, to people, even though we've been talking about it forever, that we think it could be close to 1 million barrels a day coming off, but it's at least 500,000 barrels coming off. But I definitely think it's the higher number, and you're starting to see companies, despite what their governments say that they want to stay in the deal, you're starting to see companies say, no, we can't take the risk of violating U.S. sanctions, so therefore we're not going to take Iranian oil. All of the European energy companies are saying that, despite what you're hearing from the EU foreign minister. And even today, the others, a pushback I get is, well, India and China won't comply. They'll still keep buying the oil. And indeed, the Iranian minister last week was in India meeting, and they talked about still continuing to buy oil from Iran. But today you had Reliance, the biggest energy company in India, with basically all of the big refineries, say we're not going to take any Iranian oil. So,
wow.
So what we've been talking about is that these U.S. sanctions are really going to be global sanctions. They're not just related to U.S. companies. And Iran can keep producing oil. They just need to find customers, and there aren't going to be customers for their oil. So that's another big thing that's yet to come. I think that once it becomes clear that Iran isn't going to get the benefits of the deal that the EU is promising them, they're going to exit the deal themselves. I think they've given the EU kind of an unofficial 2-month deadline. And so once that happens, I think you're going to see another. It's another catalyst for high oil prices, because there is still some consensus that believes what the EU and some of these other governments are saying. But the EU at that point is probably going to have to exit the deal themselves and reapply sanctions. So there's still another shoe to drop, I think, on Iran sanctions. Plus, we're going to start seeing the physical oil come off the market. So even if OPEC does increase, 300,000 barrels, even 500,000 barrels, I'm still very bullish on oil because of all these factors.
That's very helpful. I'll let you get back to talking to your Saudi and OPEC friends, and thanks for your time.